Okay. This interview is being conducted by the students of Silver Lake Regional High School. We're interviewing Mr. Andrew Risio. Today's date is November 8th, 2019. Right off the bat, quick questions about entering service. First, we would like to know, when did you enlist?
So I was commissioned. Officers get commissioned, soldiers get enlisted. It's a little change of terminology. I was commissioned in December 1991, fresh out of college. I graduated out of Georgia Tech, and literally part of my graduation ceremony that day was to walk by the RTC building and get sworn in as an officer. So December 91 is when I came in.
Love to hear. What branch did you join?
So I joined the Army. I was lucky that the school that I went to, Georgia Tech, had all three branches, plus Marines. Marines are part of the Navy. So we had a very large Navy detachment. Georgia Tech, the school I went to, had nuclear engineering. So because of that, it had the largest naval detachment outside of the Naval Academy, because they were all becoming nuke engineers to go ahead and run ships. Had a big Air Force contingent, a lot of aerospace engineers and those folks. And then it had a pretty small Army RTC. So I joined the Army RTC, was much more interested in that than I was, because I didn't think I could become a pilot, so I wasn't interested in the Navy or the Air Force at the time.
All right. Within the Army, was there any special training different from other branches?
Yeah, so when I joined the Army, I went to the Officer's Basic course, which is basically learning how to be an officer, learning how to do the basics of being in the Army and be in charge of people. And then I also learned about my specialty, my career field, which at the time was Medical Service Corps. And the way to think about Medical Service Corps officers were the hospital administrators of the medical branch. So I was going in to learn how to either run medical units as the leadership, or I was going in to be the administrator in hospitals, military hospitals. So that was kind of the career field that I got set into initially. But when I was going through, when I was first joining up, I was contacted by Washington, D.C., by my branch, and they said, we picked you to go to flight school. So go ahead and submit your packet to become a medevac pilot in our field. So I applied. I didn't get in. And what they did was they said, your first assignment's going to be a 1-year assignment to Korea, and then you'll be eligible to go next year to flight school. So we want you to apply next year. And it was part of the mechanics of it. They wax and wane. Some years they take kids fresh out of college into flight school in my branch. Other years they want people who've done a year or two on the ground before they take them into flight school. I just happened to catch the wave where they wanted to have people come in a couple years after flight school.
All right.
Or a couple years after on the ground.
Kind of just to tie it off, what would you say was the hardest part about leaving home to go and serve?
So it's funny. It wasn't that big of a shift for me. I'd made that decision before. So I'm from New England. I was from Rhode Island when I grew up. Mm-hmm. I made a conscious decision out of high school to go away to college. When I graduated, went to school in Rhode Island. Half the kids in my graduating class went to URI. Mm-hmm. A lot of guys went to Boston. A lot of guys went to Connecticut. Few group went to, to California, UCLA, went to, like I did, to Georgia. So I made the decision at that point that I wanted to get out, see the world, explore, kind of do stuff. Mm-hmm. So going into the military was just that next step for me. So I went in really aggressive. I asked for overseas assignments. My first 3 assignments that weren't schools in the Army were Korea, Germany. And my career was that way. I spent pretty much of my 23 years in the military, I was overseas, I think 13 years of it, 14 years. So the majority of my time, I wasn't in the United States. So for me, I love my family, not that I was trying to get away from anything, but getting out and exploring was something I wanted to do from the get-go. It really wasn't a hard decision for me. And my family kept good touch with me. I had really close ties to my family. We figured out ways, and this is back before emails and text messages and all that, and even cell phones. We used to do what was called callback. Okay. It's kind of this weird thing. When I was in Korea, you would call up a local number, hang up the phone. Let it answer. It would ring twice and answer, and you'd hang up. and then a minute later, that phone number would call you back and connect you to a stateside number that you could then dial a long distance call. And you paid a fee for this service, so you could actually get stateside long distance calls instead of paying $5 an hour, $5 a minute to call from Korea Direct. So we had things like that, but you had to work out all these different little things to stay in touch. And my family stayed pretty well, pretty good touch with me when I was out. So
it's excellent to hear.
Yep.
This is a bit of a addition.
Sure.
Why choose the military to go overseas as opposed to another career path that would allow you to travel?
Good question. It's kind of a mix.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it was I wanted to be in the military in the first place. I always been a big history buff, always read about military history. I had a bunch of relatives that had served in the service, so serving the service was kind of there. But honestly, talking to my friends,
mm-hmm.
that was the quickest and easiest way to get overseas. Pretty much guaranteed. If you go in the military and you stay in long enough, you're going to go someplace if you want to. Everybody else I knew, the guys who went and worked for GE, or guys who got out of my school went and worked for big engineering companies, working for Ford, GE, all those kind of companies. It's really actually pretty hard in those companies to get overseas and get that opportunity.
Okay.
The military had that pretty much built in. If you're in the Navy, you're going to go on a ship. If you're in the Air Force, you're going to get to fly places. If you're in the Army, you're going to get stationed overseas. So that kind of made it a little easier.
Very interesting. All right.
Great.
That's going to conclude my part of the interview.
Declan, thank you. Great questions.
Thank you.
From your early days of service, was your family supportive of you joining the military?
Yeah, so my dad had been in the Army. He'd actually served here in Massachusetts. He actually been stationed at Springfield Armory. And he'd also gone to Vietnam. And I had a lot of my family that was involved in the military, most of the Army. So very supportive. Very excited, very proud. And actually my great uncle, who'd retired as a lieutenant colonel, was the one who actually swore me in as a commissioned officer in December of '91. So,
this kind of relating to that, were there any relatives or mentors that inspired you to join the service? Yeah,
so my dad, first off, he and I were very close, and we talked a lot about service. Additionally, that great uncle, he had an amazing career. He joined the Army in 1938, before World War II. He had enlisted, was a ranger that stormed the cliffs at D-Day, had received a battlefield commission in World War I, had gone from being an enlisted soldier to being an officer, and then had served in Korea and in Vietnam, retiring as a lieutenant colonel in the infantry. And it was interesting, as I served longer, he opened up more and more to me. And he did not talk about his military service to a lot of family members, but he talked with me about a lot of it, and I kind of felt that, that sense of camaraderie and sense of openness about things was really, really helped.
Cool. What was your first assignment after training?
So after going to the basic course, I left. The basic course was in San Antonio, Texas. I left San Antonio, and my first assignment was in Korea. I was a medical platoon leader in 2nd Forward Support Battalion, 2nd Infantry Division. This was stationed up north of Seoul in a town called Tongdishan, at a place called Camp Casey. Kind of thing where you were within artillery of North Korea. And we trained really hard there and worked really hard. My job was kind of, best way to describe it, I hope you guys know this reference, MASH, the television show about the Army hospital in Korean War. A little older, it's like from the 70s. I was this debate between the front lines and MASH. That was the job I had. We would basically take patients, stabilize them, and get them back to the hospitals for surgery. That was kind of the role we played in the infantry division. And I did that for 12 months. It was great. Walking out of college after 3 months of schooling, I was dropped in charge of 40 soldiers and 10 South Korean soldiers. So I had 50 people in the platoon that I was responsible for. Huge amounts of responsibility. Had about 20 vehicles, equipment, tons and tons of equipment that I was responsible for. a huge amount of responsibility that you're basically in charge of what these people do every day, 7 days a week. A lot of responsibility. It was a great assignment. I learned about the culture of Korea, got out and explored, got to see things and do things. It was really interesting.
Was there specialized training that required you to operate the helicopters?
Yeah, so went to flight school for 12 months. So I left Korea in October timeframe, got to flight school, started flight school in November. And it's interesting, they break it into segments. So the first part of flight school is basic, which is basically teaching you how to fly the helicopter and also how to deal with every emergency that could potentially come up. Unlike airplanes, helicopters are a lot more finicky, a lot more difficult, and a lot more prone to mechanical breakdown. So we spend a lot of time learning how to successfully respond to emergencies in flight. And we always joke, it's like you have to learn how to crash a helicopter before you can learn how to fly the helicopter. And then the second part of flight school is instruments, which is learning how to fly in the clouds without anything but your instrument panel to fly on, navigating by radio and navigational beacons to fly your aircraft. So we do that for like the next 3 or 4 months. And then you do what's called basic combat skills, which at this point now you are, for all intents and purposes, a helicopter pilot. And what you're learning how to do now is fly in formation, fly low, nap at the earth, is what we call it, which is flying 10 to 25 feet off of the tree level. Learning how to do combat assaults, learning how to carry sling loads underneath the aircraft or weight, how to load troops up, how to disembark troops, all those kind of basic skills. And then graduating up to how to play an air assault as a group. So you're planning to bring 6 to 12 helicopters into an LZ, pick people up, fly a tactical route, get to your destination, disembark the troops, and successfully get out. So we would go through all that in basic combat skills. And then the last portion of what we would do would be what was called nights. We spend the last 3 or 4 months learning how to fly the aircraft using night vision goggles. So we would have basically everything would be blacked out in the cockpit, and you'd be flying with night vision goggles focused in, and you would learn those same how to fly skills and the combat skills were kind of mixed into that last stage, and you were reverse cycled the whole time. So it took about a year to get through. And the aircraft that I flew on for flight school was a UH-1 Huey, which is the standard helicopter from Vietnam that everybody knows. And then what happened was I went from, when I graduated, my choice was, it was a point of transition in the Army, and about 2/3 of the Army was flying the Black Hawk, and most of the National Guard reserves and about 1/3 of the active Army were flying Hueys. So if I left flight school with just Hueys, I would have been limited to just Hueys, and only those 130 units that still had them. And my branch came to me and said, well, you can go fly Hueys here, or if you go to Black Hawks, you have to go back to Korea. So I went through a 6-week transition. It was kind of like a mini flight school for the Black Hawk, which is basically, you already know how to fly, but here are all the little things you've got to learn about the Black Hawk that are different. And it's a completely different aircraft. So we spent 6 weeks of that, and then I went to my assignment.
Okay, cool. What was the hardest part of military life to adapt to, would you say?
Well, it wasn't real hard at first for me. Part of it was the being away from family, having to make, so when you're in an organization like a unit, especially as an officer, you have to socialize with your rank level. So you're not hanging out with those 40 guys that worked for me, 40 guys and gals. I didn't hang out with them. I wasn't socializing with them. It was inappropriate for me to socialize with them. I had to socialize with the other platoon leaders at my level or the company commanders above us. And when you look at that, and then you add in that every 2 months, half of those people are leaving. You have this constant turnover. Really puts you out. You've got to be social. You've got to make friends. You've got to learn. So there's a lot of potential loneliness there because your circle of friends is a narrow band of who you can be socializing with. So that was a tough part of that. But other than that, that was probably the biggest challenge initially. Later in my career, when you have a wife and kids, if you get married or a husband and kids, that gets to be the other challenge. For me, that became anytime I was away from them. So when you're a young guy, when I was a young gal, going away for 6 months to the point, I don't care. I'm gonna go 6 months, have fun, come back, have a lot of money saved in the bank because I haven't been spending money, go out and have fun. When you're married with kids, it's a whole different situation. I haven't seen my kids in 6 months. I haven't seen my wife in 6 months. So I would say for me, the challenges came much later in my career for those kind of things. Early, I didn't have a lot of issues or challenges for me. I was enjoying myself. So. Thanks. Good questions.
What field did you serve in during the war?
So I went to Iraq twice during OIF. So I went once in 2003, which is when the war first started. And that time I was an operations officer for a battalion. Now the battalion was supposed to have, and this gets into a little bit of the politics of the time. When I originally left Germany to go to Iraq, and if y'all don't know the history, the Iraq War was supposed to have 2 attacks. One was supposed to come out of Kuwait, and one was supposed to come out of Turkey. The coming out of Turkey was the northern option, and this was beholden to the Turkish government whether or not it was going to happen. So my job was supposed to be in charge of the medical evacuation through all of Turkey and all the way into Iraq to Baghdad, which is this huge, long, really, really long legs. Really interesting mission. We got all prepped to do it. We packed all of our equipment up, and I was the operations officer for that organization. So I was planning running 45 medevac helicopters, 80 ground ambulances, and running this entire route all the way through Turkey and all the way through northern Iraq. And this new guy got elected in Turkey right as this was happening. His name was a Drojan. Same guy who's in power right now. Part of his campaign to run for his office was to distance himself from NATO and distance himself from America and kind of be independent and strong. So our equipment actually got shipped to Turkey, got unloaded off of the ships and was on the docks, and we were getting ready to get on airplanes to go fly to Turkey when he changed his mind. And so everything in Turkey got frozen. And then for about 3 weeks, we didn't know where we were going. And then they shipped all of our equipment to Kuwait, and we were going to go in through Kuwait with everybody else. So I flew out of Germany and landed in Kuwait. And we got all the way up as far as I got up to Baghdad. And they decided that the equipment and people they needed for the Kuwait or for the Turkey part of the mission wasn't needed anymore because it collapsed so fast. So I spent about 3 months in Iraq that time and ended up going home. My second deployment, which was almost 4 years later, I went in as a commander of a medevac company. So I had 15 helicopters that were assigned to me, 150 soldiers, the crews, the aircraft, the maintenance crews, everything. And we got assigned out in the western part of Iraq to Al Anbar province. And I got assigned to work for the Marines. And this was at the height of the surge that had just started. Petraeus had decided to bring in a lot more soldiers in the hopes that he could crush the insurgency and kind of follow the model that the Marines had been using out west. So that was the time period I went in, and that's what I got to do.
All right. What campaigns did you participate in?
So going all the way back, earlier in my career, I'd actually gone to Bosnia as part of I-4 and part of S-4, which was the NATO mission to go into Bosnia to separate the combatants from fighting each other. I did those 2 deployments. And then in Iraq, I was part of the initial entry into Iraq. Like I said, I was part of that Northern Option piece. And the second part, I was part of the campaign to basically part of the surge and the awakening. Part of that was I had to spend 15 months. Normally, Army units spend 12 months on deployments. They've actually shortened that down to 9 months. Marines spent 3 to 6 months. Air Force spent 3 to 4 months in deployments. So it's interesting to hear guys talk about I've deployed 5 times. Really depends on what service they were in, what that means. I deployed twice, but one of my deployments was a 15-month deployment. I spent 15 months in Iraq during the surge. So that was the different campaigns I participated in.
All right. Do you recall any humorous or unusual events while you were serving?
I recall a lot of humorous events. Let me think. That's a good question. Let me think of a good one to kind of. I do know one. It's a little serious, but it's also it really talks to the history of the time. When I was in Bosnia, we were going out to schools in Croatia. This is part of the routes into Bosnia. And this is in 1996, a couple years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So all these East European communist countries had switched over to being, capitalistic and democracy. And we went into this classroom, and I get invited along because kids were throwing rocks at helicopters at the rotor blades, not to be mean, but to kind of see what would happen, kind of thing. And they were crowding when we would run convoys through towns. They would crowd the routes because they wanted to get candy or stuff thrown to them from the vehicles, from the GIs. And we were trying to basically say, hey, this is dangerous. You're going to get hurt. Don't worry about it. So we went to this classroom. We were talking. And walk into the classroom, and we're talking to all the teachers as we're teaching these things to the class. And one of the teachers speaks perfect English. And we were really impressed. And so we stopped her and we asked, so how did you learn English? I run into a lot of English speakers here. How did you learn how to speak English so well? And she said, well, in 91, when the Berlin Wall came down, I was a Russian teacher and taught Russian to all the kids because everybody learned Russian. And she said the next day my principal came in and dropped a book on my desk. It was an English book. And said, you're an English teacher tomorrow or you're fired. So she said I became an English teacher. So that kind of, those are the kind of changes I got to see when I was in Europe and things that happened. So maybe not funny, but.
Very interesting.
Do you recall the day service ended, and where were you when it ended?
So I retired. So for me, it was a pretty big ceremony, and I was able to retire. You're able to actually pick where you want to retire. It's one of the few advantages you get in your service. So I was stationed at Fort Detrick in Maryland, just outside of D.C. at the time. So I picked to retire at the Pentagon and retired with what's called the Old Guard. There's one military unit in the Army that does all the ceremonial duties for the Army. They're the ones who do the president stuff. They do, all the ceremonies in D.C. So they do a retirement ceremony, and you're allowed to go do it with the entire Old Guard behind you. They have a fife and drum corps dressed up in colonial uniforms. It's really cool. So I did my retirement there, and that was when I retired. And I did that. It was just 6 years ago. So I had my entire family there. They all came down, and it was a great ceremony. Got down to D.C., did the entire thing, went to the Officers Club, had a big party, and then it was done.
Okay. Did you continue any friendships after service?
Yeah. So, in fact, most of my social network is with, my peers in the military. And it's interesting, to be honest, that's why I'm on Facebook. As little as I use Facebook for me is that I have an account and everybody knows where I'm at. And I get contacted by people once or twice a month, either people who used to work for me, asking for recommendations, wanting help with things, needing work on their VA benefits, those kind of things, to good friends that I'd served with in the military that are, traveling in the area, coming to visit and everything. So, but there's probably 4 or 5 friends that I keep really close contact with from the military that I'm sure you'll be all surprised to hear I game. I'm a gamer. So I have 2 or 3 guys that I game with that are on my, group that we play PUBG and other fun things. So. But yeah.
Yeah. For those thinking of joining, what would you say are the benefits of enlisting?
I think the best thing about the military, and one thing people don't understand and don't have, I think a lot of people see the military as very conservative, as very old-fashioned, as very stoic and stuck in their ways. And honestly, nothing is further from the truth. Best thing about the military is the meritocracy. Your value in the military is what you did for me yesterday and what I've known you've done for me in the past. And it's what you can do for me tomorrow. And when you treat everybody like that, race, sex, ethnic background, sexual preference, all that gets put to the side because it's all about what can you do for me? Are you a valuable troop or are you not a valuable troop? Because you're a dirtbag, I'm going to see you on your way out the door and you're going to be gone. And the entire spirit of the military is that way. It's innovative. it pushes. And then my favorite thing about the Army, and a friend of mine had a comment and a joke. Whenever I heard somebody complaining, because we were pilots, and pilots get paid more than the people around us. We get a bonus, a monthly flight pay bonus. And we get to fly helicopters, and we get to be lazy when we're not flying helicopters. So there's a griping, the mechanics that are working on the aircraft and the medics that are being our flight medics are like, well, I could do an officer thing. My buddy always told him, flight school starts every 2 weeks. And when he was, the message conveyed is the opportunity is there. Anybody in the Army can apply to go to flight school. Anybody in the Army can apply to become an officer. Anybody in the Army can go to medical school. They can go to nursing school. They can go, So when I was in Iraq, I had 150 people that worked for me. I sent 5 to flight school. I spent 3 to OCS. I spent 2 to nursing school. I spent, name the opportunity available in the Army, jump school, air assault, all these other different things. I sent people there, and that was what I told them. I said, if you're not happy with what you're doing in the Army, there's opportunities there. And understanding how it works out, the Army is the best service for that. The joke is the Army has more aircraft than the Air Force, has more boats than the Navy. And it's true. And so of the services, I'm always a huge proponent of the Army because of what you can do. You want to do network stuff and work on computers, you can do that in the Army. You want to fly aircraft, you can go fly helicopters in the Army easier than you can in the Air Force. You like boats, you can go be an engineer and build bridges for the Army, crossing rivers. There are all sorts of opportunities available. And that's probably the biggest thing about the military is if you want to get an opportunity that you don't currently have, you can get it in the military. So.
Okay, thanks.
No, thank you. Appreciate it.
Did you enjoy your overall experience in the U.S. Army?
Yeah, I did. I was really fortunate. I got to do what I wanted to do, but largely because I saw what I wanted to do. Getting to fly helicopters was fun. I can't deny that. But also being in charge of an organization, getting to do, I was a company commander, which as a major in the Army, and 150 people, what they were going to do each day was up to me. And getting to make those decisions, working with a good team, being surrounded by great troops and great officers to go do things. And that's the other part from the previous question that I didn't bring up. The other great thing about the military is nobody's ambiguous about what we're doing today. We wake up in the morning and go into the office and everybody knows what the job is that day and what we have to get done. And the focus is there, the concentration is there, and that was another part about going to Iraq that was actually really good, was that nobody second guessed why we were there. We were there in case somebody in the middle of the night called at 3:00 in the morning because their buddy was hurt and they wanted somebody to come get him. We knew, we went, we did it. And it was having that sense of purpose and collective sense of purpose that everybody was on the same sheet, going the same direction, nobody pulling that way when everybody else is pulling this way. That's a great environment to be in. So.
What are some life lessons you learned from your military service?
Life lessons. Judging people on what they do and understanding that because leadership's hard and leadership trying to make a group of people do something that's probably really dangerous that they probably don't want to do and could potentially cost them their lives is a hard thing to do. To convince that group to selflessly go do something, to get 4 people to risk their lives for 1 person is a hard thing to do. And learning that if you do it right and if you lead with integrity, you show the same dedication that they're going to, you show the same effort, the good people are going to follow you. And it's your job to get rid of the people that aren't going to do it. And support those people that are willing to do the hard things. And unfortunately, it's 90-10%. It's 90% wanna and 10% don't. And what it really means is, to be honest, most of my hard work in the military was getting rid of that 10% so the other 90% could do what we all needed to do. One of the big jokes in the military is you spend 90% of your time on 10% of your troops that are the trouble. At the same point, probably the single most rewarding thing in the military was finding one of those 10% and converting them into the 90%. Getting one of those guys or gals who was a dirtbag who just wasn't worth it, and getting through to them and convincing them to be selfless and to do the things we needed to do to take care of those around us. That's probably the most rewarding thing in my life, getting to do.
Is there anything else we haven't talked about that you'd like to add?
I may not have said this enough during this, but I was successful in the military because of those around me. I had a great peer network. I had people, when I had a problem, and people deal with it differently, and I know it's generational. I'm a Gen Xer, and I know Gen X's are much more peer network than they are looking for a mentor above them. And I think technically your generation is much more looking for mentors, but Gen X's tend to build a network. So when I needed to make decisions or I had tough things that were challenging me, I had a network of friends at my level that I would call left and right of me and find out what they'd done in similar situations. And that network was huge. And those guys and gals, I owe tremendous debt of gratitude to all of them. And I owe a great debt of gratitude to those 90% that, right now, if anybody that I deployed with to Iraq asked me for anything, I do it. I provide it. I've got people who I commute home from Boston every day on an hour-long commute. It's not at least once a month that I'm on the phone for 45 minutes or an hour of that commute, just listening to someone talk about something they're going through. One of those people that I knew in Iraq. And that's, I would do that for them. And if they said, hey, I need some help, I would be on a plane to go out and help them out the next day. Because I owe that debt of gratitude to those guys and gals that I work with. So for me, that's probably, I haven't said that enough during this, but that's for me is a huge issue is that I was successful because of those around me, not because of me. So thank you.
Well, it was a pleasure speaking with you, Mr. Risio. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.